Hello, everybody, and welcome to Retrospective, a mini podcast from the creators of the Game Life Balance US podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Martin, and throughout the rest of 2017 and all through 2018, I'll be playing video games made from sometime between the Nintendo era through the PlayStation era, as well as all the numbered Final Fantasy games. I'll be doing a retro review on each of them as I complete them. Join me as I play some of the games that have helped shape the landscape of modern gaming. If you listen to the last Game Life Balance US podcast, we had taken a 6-month hiatus, and we're back now. And one of the things that we teased on the last episode was that I am going to be taking on this project that I just outlined with that first paragraph here. I am going to be playing a bunch of retro games over the next year, just as kind of a challenge to myself is the idea. So this is the inaugural episode, the first episode of this small side project we have going on. The way I kind of envision this working is I kind of plan on playing a retro game, coming here, doing anywhere from 10 to 30 minute podcast on it, just on my own solo thoughts on it, and kind of send that out into the world and see how that works. I'm thinking there should be quite a few of these is my plan, because generally games of that era tend to go much more quickly than your average game today. So again, we'll kind of see how this works. This is kind of my pilot episode just to see how it's going to work. And I think if you also heard in that intro, as well as if you had listened to the last episode of US of Game Life Balance US, you would have heard that the other part of this project is to play through all of the numbered Final Fantasy games, which includes going up and through the more modern games, including like Final Fantasy 12 remake when that comes out for the PC, Final Fantasy 15, etc. So I started this entire thing by playing the original Final Fantasy, a game that I had not actually ever played. So let's go ahead and get into it. Final Fantasy, if you've ever heard Cody and I talk on this podcast, which hopefully you have, hopefully this is not the first thing that you're approaching us and listening to or watching, but Final Fantasy holds a very important spot in Cody and my own nostalgia in terms of where we kind of anchor ourselves in our gaming habits. And in what we find enjoyable in video games. And I'm fairly certain he'll let me speak for him. In fact, he may even be a larger Final Fantasy fan than me. So to give you some perspective, the first experience I ever had with role-playing games was, I believe it was around 1992 or 93. It was actually at a birthday party for Cody, and he got Final Fantasy II. It's Final Fantasy IV, but Final Fantasy II in the US on the Super Nintendo. He got that for his birthday. And I, like the little jerk kid that I was, completely demolished the box to that game, opening it and getting the tasty tender bits inside out and ready to play. And that night, we played through, I cannot remember how much of that game that we played through. We played through a good amount of that game. And from that point on, I was just enraptured with the Final Fantasy series. And so I eventually got Final Fantasy IV myself. That was my first role-playing game, baby's first role-playing game. I was probably 12 or 13 is wrong. I was probably 8 or 9, something like that. Maybe 7, 8 or 9, somewhere in there. And Final Fantasy VI came out a couple years down the road, got that as well. And throughout that time, I also became more aware of Squaresoft as a developer. They quickly became my favorite developer. I bought all of their games, or I had all of the games given to me as presents, that kind of thing. And it was awesome. And that was where my true love for video games was, and frankly still is. I have a very soft spot specifically for JRPGs. So I was really excited to start this project and start it with Final Fantasy, the original Final Fantasy, because again, it is the most important series to me in terms of my gaming habits. But it's also a series that I feel guilty that there are a couple games that I haven't completed. So I had played Final Fantasy the original before. I had never completed it. I had never played Final Fantasy 2, the original, like the Japanese version of Final Fantasy 2. So I'm currently working through that. I've never I've never completed Final Fantasy 3, but I've gotten to the very last dungeon, which by all accounts is one of the hardest dungeons in any Final Fantasy game. So I'm looking forward to trying getting through that. But this is a podcast about Final Fantasy, so let's talk about Final Fantasy. So my first experience with Final Fantasy, the original Final Fantasy, was when I discovered emulation when I was in late middle school or high school. And at that time it was the kind of time on the internet where you had to go to ROM sites and download ROMs one at a time. Sometimes you had to like put a password in on Zolfar's domain or something like that to get your ROM. And as soon as I could, I downloaded the entire Nintendo collection of video game ROMs that was available on the internet. And one of them obviously was Final Fantasy. And I remember booting it up for the first time. And keep in mind that this is mid to late Super Nintendo era. So games from the Nintendo kind of felt aged at this point. And so I booted it up and I started, and it's like, hey, pick your characters, pick your 4 character classes. And I was like, I don't understand. Like up to this point, every character had been chosen for me. Their personalities and their abilities had been already deeply defined in Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, and the other Square RPGs for Super Nintendo. So I was like, what is this? So what is this choosing my own party type thing? So I'm sure I did it incorrectly the very first time that I tried it. Got into the game, had my party set up. And I remember the first thing that happens is the princess in this castle tells you, hey, go to this cave and go kill this guy. So you walk up there in this game and you go into the cave and you start getting into random battles in Final Fantasy. And there's just there are these archaic and weird, difficult to navigate systems within that game. You choose to attack an enemy, and if 2 people choose to attack the same enemy and that enemy dies, the second person's attack is just voided out because that enemy is gone. The spell system didn't make sense to me because it's based on Dungeons and Dragons rules. So at that point, I did not have the patience to get through any of it when I played it back then. And I shelved it at that point, and I had literally never tried to pick it back up again. So once I decided I was going to do this, I said, okay, I'm going to make it through the Final Fantasy games this time, especially the ones that are probably more difficult to get through. Final Fantasy 1 being top of that list. So instead of downloading the original version on an emulator, I downloaded the remake of it. So Final Fantasy had a remake back in 2003 called Dawn of Souls that came out for PlayStation, for PSP. And the PSP remake got ported to iOS, so iPad, iPhone, etc. So I had bought that iOS version probably 3 or 4 years ago when it originally came out. Never played it, and I said, all right, well, this is probably a good way to do this because I can use it as like a second screen experience. I can watch TV while I'm playing this game, etc. So I downloaded it. And that's the version that I ended up playing, was the iOS version on my iPad of the remake of the NES version of the game. So let's talk about the game a little bit. The game was originally released in 1987 for the NES, and it came to the United States in 1990. So keep in mind, the Super Nintendo was only a few years away at that point, and it took 3 years to localize this game to get it into the hands of Americans. And there actually was no European release. So those are, there's United States and Japan, and then there's basically like Europe, the PAL versions, which is everywhere else. And that they didn't actually even make one for the original Final Fantasy game. So the first version that Europe was able to get of the original Final Fantasy legally was the PSP remake, Dawn of Souls. And that was in 2003. So the game came out in Japan just a couple years after the Famicom was was out, and then it didn't come out in the US for quite a while longer. Another little fun fact, it was so Nobuo Uematsu, who is the composer of many of the Final Fantasy games, the entire games, many tracks on various Square RPGs, as well as also other soundtracks for Square RPGs. This was his first Final Fantasy, so he was on board from the very start of the entire series. So this is where he joined on. The story in the original Final Fantasy, incredibly bare bones. In fact, you could almost argue there's none at all in terms of the setup. You create your party of 4 heroes based on 6 different character classes. You find out that each of them has been given a crystal. They, I don't know, came born with a crystal. It's inside them. I don't know. It's never explicitly stated. The 4 crystals correspond to the 4 elements that pop up in the games over and over again: earth, wind, fire, and water. And something is sapping the energy out of these crystals, and it is your job to figure out what that is, and how to stop it. So the game starts off with a really take the context. So let's look at the context of the time. You know, NES games up until this point, they maybe weren't. You could consider them not necessarily the most complex things. The NES games were generally considered kind of, if you wanted more complicated things, deeper experiences, you would generally turn to the PC at this time. You know, console was very accessible. The NES was very accessible to everybody, but it didn't necessarily offer the deepest experiences. So this game kind of drops you into the world. You get told, hey, go up to this cave and go kill this guy Garland, who is a fallen knight from the kingdom. You can find that out by talking to people. He's a fallen knight that wants to take over the kingdom. So you need to go take care of him. So you go to this cave and you kill Garland and you come back, and the princess is like, okay, thanks. Now go out into the world and figure out what's going on with these crystals. And you cross the bridge that gets fixed, that they fix for you because you killed Garland. And the screen fades, and a static piece of art comes up with a scrolling screen, much like in Star Wars, to introduce the story of the game. And it scrolls and tells you all about the crystals and what you're doing. And at the time, and granted, keep in mind, I did not play this at the time, but what you can imagine that it would feel like this incredibly epic experience to never have this kind of broad open world in a game before and suddenly just be dropped in and said, okay, like, now go explore and figure out the game that we've laid before you without pretty much any guidance at all. And so you cross the bridge and the whole adventure starts. And games did not, specifically role-playing games like this, did not direct you almost at all back in the late 80s and early 90s, more so late 80s. So in Final Fantasy, you'll often just have to kind of stumble upon the next objective without any piece of guidance. So that's pretty interesting. The other interesting thing is that you, as I alluded to before, you create your party out of 6 different character classes. And the character classes are fighter, it's like fighter, monk, white mage, black mage, red mage, and thief. And the first time you play this game, you don't know it, but those characters will be upgraded to new classes late in the game, maybe 3/4 of the way through the game. But you can choose any combination of those 6 classes that you want. You could have a party, if you'd like, of 4 white mages to play through the game. And that was a specific design decision based around Dungeons & Dragons, which this game, Final Fantasy, draws heavily on. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the very first time I played through this game and completed it, just roughly a week ago, I had used kind of a standard cookie cutter party of fighter, monk, black mage, and white mage. It kind of rounds out all of the things that you would need. But there are plenty of playthroughs of this game that you can find where people played through with 4 of one class, or 2 damage dealers of 2 different classes. So like it can add an incredible amount of challenge and replayability by having all of those different combinations of classes that are available. The game itself is turn-based, so if you've played other Final Fantasy games, like me, from 4 on, they used the active time battle system, which is a kind of a hybrid between turn-based and real-time combat. This was still back when the role-playing games were turn-based combat, much like Dungeons & Dragons. So enemy takes a turn, I take a turn, enemy, back and forth. All your actions for your party are chosen up front. All the enemy's actions are chosen up front. And then whoever is fastest, whoever the highest agility stat goes first. Very basic combat system. There's attack, there's magic, and there's items. That's pretty much it. In the original incarnation of this game, magic did not use magic points, which was a staple. It's a staple of the series. Fire may cost 5 magic points. Fire 2 may cost 10 magic points. Fire 3 may cost 15 magic points. And you have a pool, and each spell, generally, you cast that spell, and it takes magic points from that pool until you're down to 0 and can't cast spells anymore. The original incarnation of this game did not have that. What it had was the same magic system that Dungeons & Dragons had. If you ever played the original Dungeons & Dragons or AD&D, they had a spells per day system. So as your character leveled up, there would be 8 levels of spells, and you may start off with 3 casts of a level 1 spell and 1 cast of a level 2 spell, and as you level up, you'll get more casts of those first level spells, second level spells, and eventually unlock the ability to cast those higher level spells. This game was the exact same. As you level up, you get the ability to cast higher level spells. You have to actually buy magic at shops, which is interesting. It uses gold then as a resource to buy the spells. And it means that you're locked out of some spells once they until you level up to the point where they can become available. So you may get to a town with level 5 spells, which is what happened the first time that I played. But my black and white mages had only unlocked to level 3 spells. So that then kind of pushed me to level up a little bit in the surrounding town so I could buy some of those spells and become more powerful before I moved on to the next dungeon. It is just that. It is a very basic combat system, and you go through the game, you kill the 4 fiends, the 4 elemental fiends. This is the first game that they appear in. In the remake, that unlocks some optional dungeons that you can do, but you basically kill all the fiends, and then you're told, hey, this guy Chaos traveled 2,000 years in the past to destroy the universe and become immortal, because that's the way that works. You follow him and you kill him. So you follow him 2,000 years into the past, and then you kill him, and then the world is saved. That is the structure of the game. Again, it's very, very bare bones, very basic. Much less story and much more gameplay. So the random encounter rate is incredibly high. Some of the boss battles are extremely difficult. And so I think that is where the creators of the game really kind of meant for the gameplay to go. Because there's kind of no story at all that you're really experiencing. That said, there's a lot of value in this game in terms of the replayability based on the character classes. At least for me, when I kind of stepped back after I was done playing the game and looked at it, I said to myself, okay, the game, like, I don't really care about seeing this story again at all. But I would love to maybe, there's 2 classes I didn't even play with. I didn't even play with Red Mage or Thief. And those classes, like, the Thief turns into a ninja when he upgrades his classes, which is like one of the most powerful classes in Final Fantasy games, in the later Final Fantasy games. So I would kind of love to see how that works. The boss battles turned into a very rote system for me when I was playing the game. So they all turned into, about halfway through the game, they all turned into, okay, I'm going to spend the first 3 or 4 turns buffing up every single member of my party. And by the time everybody is buffed up, I had done enough physical damage with my physical damage dealers to kill everything. So that strategy worked up until the very last boss, and it worked on the last boss as well. So it kind of made the battles were still difficult because there were some enemies that could do enough damage to kill me, but generally the game just became an exercise in the same setup over and over again. And in that case, it became slightly tedious. But by changing up the party, I can see how it would make it more difficult. Playing without a warrior would make the game much more difficult because they absorb an incredible amount of damage. So if you have somebody with much less defense, I imagine it would be a much more difficult game. There are so many parallels to Dungeons and Dragons, and when I was doing a little bit of reading about the game, it's very intentional. The game the creators made the game to be a video game version of Dungeons and Dragons that you could play by yourself. Because one of the hardest things about D&D is getting a group of people together on a regular basis to play. So they wanted to make a game like D&D, and so that's why they give you the option to roll all of your characters at the start and have them all be the same class if you want. They didn't want to put any restriction that they didn't have to put on the game. Other than that, I would say the game was worth playing for me, if nothing else, to give me some perspective in where the whole series started. Because the series is such an important piece of my gaming history, it kind of felt like, especially not having ever played this one seriously and literally never having touched Final Fantasy II, it kind of made me feel like there was this hole in my gaming historical knowledge, especially for a series that is so important to me. So if nothing else but to other than kind of like as an academic exercise and to give me some perspective, this was a great game to play. And I don't know if I'll play it again, but if I did, and if you ever decide to play it, I would recommend trying a different combination of characters than just your standard warrior, monk, white mage, black mage, because it did kind of trivialize some of the later parts of the game and make it slightly tedious. So I'll just leave you with a couple of fun facts about the game. There was a rumor, an old wives' tale, that the reason why the game is called Final Fantasy is because Square, as a studio, was going out of business, and this was the last attempt that they were going to have to make a video game. And so this was the final fantasy that they were going to be able to create. And if it didn't hit, then Square was going to go out of business. That story is not actually true. It makes a great story, but it's not actually true. The only reason why the game is called Final Fantasy is because the original creator of the game, Hironobu Sakaguchi, wanted to make a game that abbreviated to FF. That is the only reason. And originally they wanted the game to be called Fighting Fantasy, but that name was taken by a board game already, so they had to call it Final Fantasy. And lastly, the battle system, when you look at it, was actually inspired by American football. So the creator of the battle system put the enemies on one side of the screen and the protagonists on the other side of the screen, and just like in a match of football, they run at each other and fight. So just a couple of interesting points I thought were kind of fun facts about the game. And if you are trying to find this game to play, I believe it's available on Virtual Console for Wii U and Wii, if those are still live when you're listening to this. I feel like iOS is probably the easiest way to play it now. I think it's somewhere between a $5 and $10 download, and I'm pretty sure you can play it on phones. Again, I played it on an iPad, but I'm pretty sure you can play it on phones as well, and it plays totally fine. When you think about it, it's a completely turn-based game, so you don't need any kind of Twitch-based gaming or very specific control over and very like nuanced control of any kind. So it actually works really well as an iOS game. And it is the easier version of the game by just the sheer fact that it's the remake. So it is definitely more accessible than the NES version of the game. As usual, you can also find it on emulation, and you can do that online using something like Nesticle or and play it that way. So if you want to get the true original experience, that is also a way that you can go. So that concludes the first episode here of Retrospective, the kind of the mini podcast for the Game Life Balance US podcast. I just want to say thank you for listening to we'll call it a Game Life Balance US podcast. You can like, share, and subscribe to our podcast if you really want to make our day. And you can find us on the Gonna Geek Network at gonnageek.com or on wgnradio.com. You can learn more about Game Life Balance, including our contact information and links to our sister store in Australia at gamelifebalance.us. I'm going to try to have these go up on the same RSS feed if I can get with Cody and figure out exactly how that works as all of our other podcasts. It's just going to kind of be a side podcast that gets released whenever I do it. So it's not going to be on a regular basis. Our Game Life Balance US podcasts will still be done every other week, and those will be on a regular Thursday. They'll be posted on Thursday, just like a regular basis. So once again, thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.